this presentation, I affectionately call it the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. It's about private investigators. A little bit about myself. Again, my name's John Morris. I have multiple companies, a few of them, EVCO LLC, EVCO Investigations, Greeley Process Server LLC. I am a licensed private investigator and a certified process server. I have some contact information there. As was stated in my introduction, I do have a YouTube channel. I am famous to the thousands out there as the PI guy. I do regular training sessions about being a private investigator. When I got started as a private investigator about 14 years ago, there was very little information to help new and aspiring PIs. And I had got a contract with a large Denver PI firm that did mostly workers' compensation. Well, at that time, they had just got a new workers' compensation contract, and they needed some surveillance investigators. And the company didn't really even know what they were doing with surveillance and stuff. So I had got online. I found a guy on MySpace, if you guys remember that. And he had like 6 or 7 10-minute videos that just taught about how to do workers' compensation surveillance jobs. And I really learned a lot about that. I actually went into my interview with this company knowing more about how to do surveillance than what they knew, because they were mostly doing criminal and domestic cases and things like that. And I've always had a passion for training people. So as I grew my business and I grew the knowledge, I wanted to be able to give back to the profession. And so I started creating in early 2020, I started up the PI Guy, where I do regular weekly, sometimes twice a week, training on different topics with private investigations. I also have multiple books. I've got some of them up there on the screen. You'll probably notice a theme in there: business basics, marketing basics, and sales basics for private investigators. Those are all very, very basic books about getting into the business and starting it for the new and aspiring private investigator. Now, you guys are all much better authors than me, I can guarantee you. My books are kind of dry. They're kind of like a text manual, but they're really made to help people get out there. And I wanted to, instead of having one big book, I wanted to have 3. So if somebody knows a lot about marketing, they may not need that book, but they might want to know how to do sales, because sales is kind of special especially when you do most of that online or on the phone, really. And then I created another one called Contracts for Private Investigators: The Secrets No One Else Will Tell You. In the PI world, a lot of people covet the secrets of things. And that's why I started the PI Guy and I made all this stuff, because nobody really wants to share. A lot of people get really worried about the competition. And I don't mind. I've trained some of my best competitors out there in my market. I spent a great deal of time before I became a PI working for corporate America, making millionaires millions. I decided to get out and do my own thing. And I took all that knowledge working in upper management and corporations. I spent a lot of time working on contracts, writing large contracts with our legal team. And I built a private investigator contract. And my book for that actually walks a new PI through the process of writing their own contract. It does have a template for a contract, but I didn't want to just sell them a contract. It goes through step by step, so the reader can actually go through and they can write each piece they want, and they understand why it's there and why they need to have it, or they may not need to have it. So that's a little bit about me. And like I said, I know it's probably nothing compared to the books that you guys do. They're really like text manuals. So we'll jump into the main presentation. I'm going to cover the most common myths about private investigators first. The first one is that PIs have the coolest vehicle. This is my surveillance vehicle here, folks. Okay, I don't have a red Ferrari. Well, I do have one like this, but sometimes I'm not allowed to play with it. I have several grandsons, and on occasion they let me have it. But we don't run around in red Ferraris or yellow Corvettes or anything like that. Now, some people that are PIs might have cool cars, but it's usually not going to be their car that they're running out and doing all the work in the field in. A common myth is that PIs arrest criminals. We do not arrest criminals. There are a lot of private investigators that are former LE, law enforcement, but they don't have arrest powers any more than a regular citizen. Each of you and myself, we could all go out and we could do a citizen's arrest per the regulations and the authorities of our state, municipalities, and things like that. But even if we're former law enforcement, we do not have the powers to go out and arrest criminals. PIs hunt down criminals. We don't really do that too much either. We may work as a bounty hunter. It's not normally a part of being a PI. I don't do bounty hunting, but I have some bounty hunter clients that on occasion when they're looking for somebody in Colorado, they may call me or contact me and I help them locate that person. I'll do a skip, I'll do a locate, I'll be the boots on the ground looking, trying to figure out where that individual is. But we're normally not out there hunting down criminals in our day-to-day works. PIs are like law enforcement, FBI and CIA and other secret agents. I am none of the above. I don't have any special powers to enforce the law. I don't have any access to all of their databases or anything like that. PIs can break or circumvent the law. A PI is held to the same standards of the law as any citizen. And most private investigators have to carry a license. Almost every state, there's 6 or 7 states that do not have licensing for private investigators, but the rest do. And the ones that do have licensing, that license holds us to a higher standard of the law usually than even the normal individual out there. But we can't break the law. If we're doing surveillance, we can't be driving 20 miles an hour over the speed limit to try to find somebody. We can't break any laws while we're doing our jobs out there. PIs can wiretap phones and hack emails. This is huge on TV and in the movies and everything. There is this little thing called the Federal Wiretap Act, and it forbids the recording of any face-to-face conversation, telephone call, email, text, or electronic communication that is reasonably expected to be private. And that's a real key in there. I always teach private investigators, you need to understand reasonable expectations of privacy. So I can't just go out and tap somebody's phone or anything like that. It is against the law. I get a lot of phone calls from potential clients that want me to do that, want me to hack into somebody's email, and it's just because they watched one too many of those crazy shows out there on TV. Reasonable expectation of privacy, it varies from state to state, but generally it's the same. Anywhere you go that you should reasonably expect to be private, then there is a reasonable expectation of privacy. That's according to the laws. So if you're in your backyard and if you have a 6-foot privacy fence, let's say, somebody can't stick a camera up over the top of that 6-foot privacy fence and shoot video in your backyard. You have a reasonable expectation of privacy to be there. If you go to a gym and you're going to do a workout, even if I'm following you, I'm watching you, and I go into the gym, when I sign in, even if it's a day pass there's a little piece of writing at the bottom of most of those that say you cannot record anything, you can't video or audio record or anything like that. That automatically gives the members and the clients of that business reasonable expectation of privacy. So we'll get a little more into that a little later, but the federal wiretapping laws don't allow us to do anything that is that would break the reasonable expectations of privacy. There are single party states that allow any conversation to be recorded if one party to the conversation is aware of the recording. So like I'm in Colorado. Colorado is a one party state. So if you are in Colorado and me and you are having a conversation, I can record that conversation without your knowledge, with some exceptions, and we'll get into that too. But if you're in Minnesota, I don't know what the laws are there. If you are a two-party state and I'm calling you from a one-party state, I would have to adhere to the tougher or the more stringent rules. So I would have to make you aware that I was recording there. It's not always where I'm at, it's where both parties are. You have to go with the more stricter of the regulations. And PIs don't have subpoena power. We can't subpoena those records for emails. We can't subpoena those records for texts. And by the way, you can't get text records from a phone company. You can maybe, if you can get an attorney to subpoena, you're going to get the phone numbers that they texted and the times, but you're not going to get the messages. I don't know of a single carrier out there that actually maintains or keeps any of those text records anywhere. But we don't have subpoena power. Attorneys can have that through the court. They have to go to the court and ask for that. That's really about the only way that you would get that. Or to get a wiretap, you'd have to have a subpoena from a court that allows you to have a wiretap. And again, a PI can't do that. And even if an attorney was able to get a court to allow a wiretap through a subpoena, they're not going to have a PI do that. They're going to have law enforcement do that. So PIs can access bank accounts. This is another big one that I get a lot of calls that people want to know, especially in domestic situations. They want to know how much money their ex-husband has in the bank account or the former business partner. I'm going to start off with pretexting a financial institution is against the law. Back in the old days, what a lot of PIs would do, I've never done this. I would have always thought it to be unethical, but they would pretext a financial institution. So in the old days, they might, if they wanted to know how much money you had in your bank and they had a good idea of where you bank, they might just call that bank and say, hey, this is John Smith. I need to know how much money I have in my checking account. I'm going to go out and buy a bunch of furniture. I need to make sure I have enough money there. And a lot of times the banks would just give that information if the person, sounded credible enough. And sometimes they would even get social security numbers and dates of birth. Laws have been passed. You cannot pretext a financial institution. It's against the law. And there have been numerous times in the past where private investigators and other individuals have faced some fairly severe consequences for pretexting financial institutions. Public records may, and I have that highlighted there, may provide information regarding where a subject banks at. So for instance, I could look at bankruptcy records, divorce records, civil lawsuits if somebody's been sued, and I may get a clue of where you banked at. So if you had a bankruptcy 5 years ago, on that bankruptcy, you had to list all of your assets. One of those would have been bank accounts. Chances are most people, the bank that they had their checking account at, their savings account at, wasn't written off in the bankruptcy, so they're probably still banking there. Nobody wants to change banks. It's not an easy process today. If they went through a divorce or if they went through a civil lawsuit of any kind, they had to fill out forms that are called interrogatories. And in those, they list all of their assets, and they would have listed their bank accounts. A lot of times they'll list the bank account number, things like that. Again, when you have information like that, then you can go to the attorney if you're working for an attorney, and the attorney can request a subpoena for records from the court to be able to go out and get that. There's also financial fraud investigators. They have some limited access to trace some historical data. This isn't normal line of business for most PIs. A certified fraud investigator or a financial fraud investigator. I have had some pretty big cases in the millions, tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of dollars where we've had to trace funds to banks, even in other countries. And I've had to use some financial fraud investigators to help me obtain that. But they don't have like some secret database out there that tells them this person banks over here and this is how much money they had at 6 a.m. this morning. They would have to go through and actually trace wires and transfers and funds and things like that. It's a fairly long process and a very expensive process for the client too. So usually that's not going to be something that's going to be done unless you're talking, like hundreds of millions of dollars in a lawsuit or something. Again, PIs do not have subpoena power, so we cannot just subpoena all the banks and find out where anybody has. And none of the databases that we have would have actual financial information in them. I'm going to move to clarifying partial myths about private investigators. So far, I kind of talked about some of the big myths, some of the big things out there that people think. These are partial myths that are sort of true and sort of not. PIs have access to non-public private information. PIs are well-versed in researching public data. I'm sure a lot of you have to do a lot of research when you're writing or, whether you're reading other people's books and learning how to write certain storylines or whatever, you're probably doing a lot of research out there. PIs are very well versed at researching public data. We are good at what's called OSINT investigations, open source intelligence investigations. And this is using everything out there in the open source and gathering that information. It's not non-public, it is public information. Are we going to get some private information from time to time? Yes, but it's not necessarily in a database. I might find, let's say, an old resume of yours from 10 years ago up on the internet somewhere, whether you left it there or a company left it there, or it was on a job postings website or something like that. And in there, you might have your address and your phone number, things like that. I would be able to get if I couldn't find it through other means. PIs are reasonably familiar with obtaining court records. And I say reasonably because the question isn't so much about the competence of the PI, it's about obtaining the court records. Every court is a little different in how you get court records, whether it's municipality, whether it's a county, whether it's a state, and state to state, they're all different. For instance, in Colorado, we have a system that's called co-courts that we can get access to. And co-courts has all, what some people say, all records of the county courts, but they really don't have all of them because there are several counties that do not report to co-courts. So with those, a trained PI is going to be able to go to that county and pull those records. Those records also do not have municipal records in there. They don't have federal records in there. They only have county records in there. So if I'm hunting down information for somebody in Minnesota, I've got to do a whole lot of research or find a PI in Minnesota that has a lot of information on how to gather court records up there. PIs have access to specialized private investigator database systems. We do. And I call them specialized private investigator database systems because it sounds really cool. But these are actually database systems that can be accessed by other legal professionals, skip tracers, process servers, bounty hunters, different people out there. Some of them, like one of the more popular ones you may have heard of, is a system called LexisNexis. Most states use that to kind of gather all of their information. Co-courts is, the backbone of co-courts is LexisNexis. It doesn't have everything. You have to have specialized access to a lot of these things, but we have different database systems out there. I'll throw out a bunch of acronyms like IRB, IDI, TLO. These are all different database systems that private investigators use. CLEAR is another one. I always recommend for most private investigators to have 2 or 3 database systems because I might be using one day and it's really, really accurate on current license plate numbers. And then all of a sudden they can't get current license plate numbers. So I have to go to somebody else for my license plate information or, utility hookups or something like that. So we do have these specialized private investigator database systems, but they are secured and they're very difficult to get access to. They vet, the companies that own these vet private investigators extremely diligently, even more so than the licensing processes for PIs. And a good example, Colorado used to have private investigator licensing. We don't anymore. Our governor, in his infinite wisdom, and I'm not going to go into all the politics of it, but I am a president of the PPIC, Professional Private Investigators Association. We had got licensing reinstated some years back for private investigators. When it came up for our 5-year sunset, we had both sides of the aisle in both houses in a major majority support us for licensing, and our governor vetoed our licensing bill. Just said, nope, I don't think you guys need it. And that creates a lot of problems because the database companies would like to look at licensing and say, well, if you're licensed, then you met certain criteria like a CBI and an FBI fingerprint background and things like that. We don't have that in Colorado, so now the database companies have to do their own vetting, and it gets a lot harder. I am still a licensed private investigator. I'm licensed in Wyoming. A lot of the private investigators just went out to other states and got licensed out there. But it's not real easy. Just Joe Blow off the street can't just go and sign up. They're going to vet. They're going to come and inspect your office. They're going to make sure that you're secured. The picture that you saw with me in the background, that is my office. It's not my office as I as it looks today. It's a lot messier right now. That's actually from way back in 2015, but I have no windows. I have locked doors, everything like that to make it extremely secure. So when they come in and inspect my office, they know that it's good. PI databases contain some very, very sensitive information, such as social security numbers, full address history. I've gotten address history for people back into the 60s and 70s out of database systems. Employment history, vehicle data to include license plate numbers, registrations, registration addresses. Sometimes somebody's got a vehicle and they've got their ownership address at one house and it's registered at another house, or they have registered drivers on the vehicle. Gives us license plate numbers, VIN numbers, relatives and friends, all of their information, addresses, phone numbers, you name it, it gets it all. We get a lot of information about bankruptcies, liens, and judgments, which then we can go back and we can verify. If I saw somebody had a bankruptcy, it's going to give me that bankruptcy number. I can now go to the federal system called PACER, and I can pull up that bankruptcy record. And in there, I can see that you had a bank account 5 years ago when you filed for bankruptcy at Bank One. And I can say, well, you probably got one there. I can go to the attorney and say, subpoena Bank One and see if they have an account there. Criminal arrest information, as well as conviction information in there. Real estate information. We get a lot of real estate stuff in there. Again, this can tie us to banks too, because I'll usually, if you have a mortgage out there and I pulled you up on the database, it's going to tell me who you have that mortgage with, how much you paid for that house, and a whole lot of other information there. Phone history, and when I say phone history, that's going to be phone number history and where that number was registered, not necessarily your phone records, like who you were calling or who you were texting, but it's going to give me those phone numbers and email addresses tied to you. And the list just goes on and on. I could probably spend an hour talking about what databases do and still miss half of it. And every one of those databases is a little different in how they present the information and what kind of information that they present and the accuracy of it or the timeliness of it, and it fluctuates and changes. PIs can record conversations. We're going to go back to that a little bit. The answer is yes and no. It all really kind of depends. Again, in a one-party state, it allows conversations to be recorded if at least one party to the conversation is aware that it's being recorded. Two-party states allow conversations to be recorded if at least two parties are aware. So if you're in a state that's a two-party state and there's 10 people in a conversation, if two of those people are aware that it's being recorded, then it's legal to record that conversation. So if me and another private investigator are talking to you and we are in a two-party state, me and that other private investigator are aware of that conversation being recorded, it's legal for it to be recorded. There are a few states, one or two, that are all party states where everybody in the conversation has to be aware of the conversation. That's not, I think it's only one or two. California, I believe, might be an all party. They used to be. And there was one other. There are some special circumstances, though, that prohibit and change all of this. Working for an attorney is one of them. This is true in Colorado, and it's true in a lot of states. If I am working for an attorney, I must abide by and follow the laws, the rules, the regulations, the ethics of the attorney. And here in Colorado, under the attorney ethics laws, they cannot, I'm going to try to get this word right, surreptitiously record somebody or secretly record somebody. So if I'm working for an attorney, I cannot record you even if I'm in a one-party state and you're in a one-party state. Now, I have to make them aware of it. So I have to abide by all of that attorney's ethics laws and their rules and regulations too. So now let's talk about what exactly do private investigators do. Many PIs do surveillance. Surveillance, folks, can be very boring. This is what surveillance looks like. If you're a surveillance investigator, this is what I looked like for the first few years while I was doing surveillance, just sitting, because that's all I did when I got started as a PI. I did surveillance 6-7 days a week. I sat in a car and I stared at a window. I stared at somebody's door. I watched a car. And I waited and I waited and I waited. It's extremely boring. Don't get me wrong. There's probably some excitement on occasion, but it's really a very boring job. But surveillance can be very dangerous too. But the danger isn't what everyone always thinks. It's not the bad guy running out and he's going to shoot you. You're not going to have people wanting to beat you up all the time. I have had cases where somebody's come out and confronted me. They've noticed me in my car. But the biggest danger is the element. It was 93 degrees here today, which is a kind of a hot day for Colorado, but then it's also July. 93 degrees. If I'm sitting in a surveillance car, I'm covert, I'm hunkered down, all my windows are up, my car is not running. Even if I'm in the shade, it's 105 degrees in that car. If I'm in the sun, it's 140 degrees in that car. The same goes for if it's January and it's 10 degrees below zero. You guys are from Minnesota, you probably understand some cold weather a little bit. It can get cold. Now it's nice because you're a little warmer in a car, but the dangers are really more about all of the elements out there, because you're sitting in that car on an 8-hour job. You've been sitting in there for 6 hours and 22 minutes. Your head, your brain is frying because it's so hot out there. And all of a sudden your subject goes active and you have to try to be coherent and follow them safely. It's not always the easiest thing. So there's a lot of things we have to do to try to keep ourselves safe and healthy while we're inside those cars. Surveillance can be exciting. The follow, the chase, they're exactly like this. They're really not exactly like this. In fact, this is everything that's wrong. If a PI is doing surveillance and this is what's happening during his follow, something is seriously, seriously wrong. We're always going to be much more covert versus overt. This would be more of an overt situation. There are very few times that a PI is hired to do overt surveillance. We've taken on some of those in my company, but there, maybe a handful of them over 14 years. But we'd never be like this. If this is happening during our surveillance, something has gone terribly wrong. Probably that PI sat in that hot car just a little too long. So many PIs also do criminal defense. This is one of the things that my company does. I do a lot of criminal defense. It can be exciting. It can be boring. There's a whole lot of reading. There's a whole lot of studying. There's a whole lot of looking at everything out there. Criminal defense investigations are going to include interviewing witnesses, reviewing discovery. Discovery is everything that you get from the other side. So in a criminal case, it's everything you get from the prosecution. In most states, if not every state, I believe every state it is, I know it is in Colorado, they are required to give you everything. The prosecution has to give you everything that they have regarding the case. The defense does not have to give prosecution everything, because it's not the defense's job to do anything. It's the prosecution's job to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. But they have to give you everything. So the bigger the case is, if you're talking a capital crime, you're going to have thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of discovery to go through, video recordings. Today all the police have body-worn cameras, audio recorders, everything like that. When they interview or interrogate somebody, that's all recorded. You have to go through all of that, and you have to review all of that information. You have to review all of the police reports, all the police investigation, crime scene investigation. The biggest challenge for PIs with crime scene investigation is nobody calls me up at 2:32 when they found that dead body and say, will you come down and do a crime scene investigation? Because they don't know that they're going to need me as a criminal defense investigator at that time. I'm going to go out months, sometimes years after the crime has been committed. So I'm going to be looking at an intersection or looking at a building, something like that there is no yellow tape. People have repainted over things. I've got to try to recreate everything based on all of the discovery and the police reports and everything else. And then court testimony is really where it comes down to for PIs. And this is why a lot of PIs don't do a lot of criminal defense, because if you do criminal defense, you are more than likely going to spend a lot of time on the stand. If you do surveillance for workers' comp, I know guys out there that have been doing surveillance for 20 years and have been called into court twice. It's just not that common to get called in. Usually that's going to be settled way before it ever gets to a court of law. In a criminal matter, most of those, well, not all, but 50% of them are going to end up in court. And out of that 50% that end up actually at a trial, probably 20 to 30% at least are going to require you, the PI, to take the stand. And all of the other stuff doesn't matter. You throw it all away if you can't give testimony. Your interviews mean nothing if you can't take the stand. The other side has the right to cross-examine all of your work. So all the interviews have to be able to be cross-examined, the review of the discovery, any problems you might have found in the police investigation, in the crime scene investigation, you have to be able to take that stand. And I'll give you a good example of some cases that I got a while back. There was a good friend of mine up here in northern Colorado that did a lot of criminal defense. When I first got started, I did mostly surveillance. He kind of took me under his wing. He was a little older. He was teaching me some different things. He also did TSCM, technical surveillance, countermeasure, bug sweeps, but he did a lot of criminal defense stuff too, former law enforcement. And he taught me a lot of that stuff. He passed away a while back. His clients contacted me and said, hey, would you take over these investigations for us? And I said, absolutely, I can. Some of them wanted me to take over right where he was, and I couldn't, because the witnesses he had interviewed, I didn't interview those people. Anything I said was simply hearsay. I had to re-interview all of those people. I had to re-review the discovery to understand what he saw. I could look at his report and it would give me flags to look at, but I still had to review all of it. I had to look at the entire police investigations. I had to go through everything. So when I went to court, I was able to say, that witness told me this, and this is how they presented themselves. I could say, this is what I saw in the police investigation. And when I went and did the crime scene investigation, this is what the intersection looked like, not what it looked like according to the police report, things like that. So court testimony is hugely important. And that goes the same in any investigation, whether it's criminal defense or a domestic case or whatever. You have to be able to give testimony, or it's all hearsay. It would never be admitted in court. Some PIs do cheating spouse investigations, but it's not as prevalent as a lot of people think. This is one thing that a lot of people just think we're all out there chasing cheating spouses. My company does some on a limited basis. It's going to have some special pieces to it and stuff like that. Going through them, most PIs don't do these. They're ugly, they're dirty, they're not always the fun thing to do. It takes a lot of surveillance. That surveillance is usually going to be at night. Nobody likes to do surveillance, and none of our clients like to pay for 2 or 3 investigators. If I am doing surveillance at night, I require 2 or 3 investigators just because of the difficulties involved. I lose a lot of jobs because of that, but I'm not going to go out and lose somebody or be working a domestic case and have the person all of a sudden realize that I'm surveilling them or one of my investigators is surveilling them. Now the gig's up. They're going to be able to put 2 and 2 together. They're going to be able to figure out who probably hired that person. There's the outcome often has no relevance in court for cheating spouses. Colorado is a perfectly good example. It's not that way in every state, especially when you get down south. They take cheating a whole lot more serious. But in Colorado, it is, when it's in regard to divorce, it is a no-fault divorce state. Anybody can file for divorce for any reason or no reason at all. And if somebody's cheating, the court doesn't even consider it. Now, if there's child custody involved, that may have a little bit of a play to it, depending on what's going on when the people are with their children and stuff. But generally, it's not going to make any difference in a court of law as to whether somebody can be divorced or not. It's not going to make a difference usually in splitting up the assets or anything like that. So I don't take a lot of those because it's not going to matter, unless they just want to know. Sometimes they just hire and they just want to know. Is it happening or is it not happening? And it can require a lot of undercover work, going into bars, going into those dark places at night. And it takes a special mindset, a special person to be able to just go into a bar. If you think about it, if you go out to a nightclub tonight and you sit by yourself in the far corner, you're probably going to stand out because everyone else is there. They're couples, they're groups, everyone's having a good time and you're just standing there. So you really have to be trained to be able to do that undercover work, to be able to go out and do that. And you have to know when you have to leave and when it's a good time to leave and when it's not a good time to go in. Some PIs do child custody investigations. My company does a lot of child custody investigations. One of the things that we do when we start these is it's called a lifestyle investigation. We're not necessarily trying to find a lot of dirt on the person. We want to see what their lifestyle is like. Is it conducive to being a good place for the children to be at? Sometimes, a lot of times, it's going to include a lot of surveillance again. We're going to surveil the parent. We're going to surveil and investigate the grandparents, other family members, friends, any associates of that parent, just to see what their lifestyle is like. Are they hanging out with drug dealers? Are the children potentially being exposed to places that they shouldn't be exposed to? We're going to do surveillance when they have the subject, and we're going to do surveillance when they don't have the subject. We want to see what that difference is. Do they have a completely different life when the children aren't there? And is there a chance that that life may flow over into the lives when they have their children? Grandparents are often the clients for child custody investigations. And for me, grandparents are the best clients because they can move the emotion out. And to be quite frank, they have deeper pockets. So they're still doing it for an emotional reason, but they also have the money to pay for surveillance. Surveillance is one of the most expensive things a PI will ever do. You might hire a PI to do a background and they're going to charge you 150, 250, 350 bucks, something like that. Surveillance, you're going to go out and do surveillance for 4 weekends, you're going to pay thousands of dollars for that. And not everybody has that kind of money to spend. And usually when we're doing child custody investigations, I want to have 2 investigators out there because, again, on the follow, I don't want them to get suspicious, especially when there's children involved. I don't want a child and a child will notice you a whole lot quicker than an adult will. I don't want a child to get worried because some guy in a black sedan's been following them every weekend when they're at daddy's house. We just have to be really, really careful when there's children involved. And we just don't want to get burned just because, again, they can put 2 and 2 together and they'll figure out what's going on, who hired them, and everything like that. Other PI jobs, I'm going to go through kind of quick here with a lot of other private investigator jobs. I have a video that I actually did this all in a 1-minute video on one of mine, but there are literally hundreds of jobs. I'm just going to go through some of the more prevalent ones out here. Background checks and background investigations. They're kind of the same. They're kind of not. A background check is usually going to be something where I'm going to run you through the databases. We're going to see what information comes up. You had some arrests, you had some of this, whatever. Give us some addresses. An investigation is going to be more boots on the ground, making some phone calls, verifying that data. If I'm trying to find somebody, I'm going to do more of an investigation and go out and confirm that data that I found. Missing persons investigations. This takes a lot of special resources and special training. We don't do a lot directly in-house. I have some folks that I bring in from time to time on a missing persons, but usually I'm going to refer this over to other companies. A lot of former law enforcement are a lot better out there to beat the pavement and knock on doors and get answers from people on a missing person investigation. Timing is really important on missing persons investigations, getting out there very, very quickly and getting the information. Due diligence investigations. If you're looking to go into business with somebody, you might want to do a due diligence investigation on that individual, see what their background was, especially publicly held companies. If they're looking to bring in their next CEO, their COO, people like that, they're going to want to do a due diligence background investigation on that person because it may not seem relevant to a lot of people, but what they got thrown in jail for in 1978 may come up in the news when they start running a publicly traded company. So due diligence investigations is one that a lot of people do. We do quite a few due diligence investigations. Interviews and neighborhood canvassing, those can happen in just about any kind. We talked about it a little bit with the criminal investigations. But you're going to go out, you're going to interview the witnesses, neighborhood canvassing, you're going to be knocking on the doors, you're going to be talking to business owners. If it's a criminal case that happened downtown by a bar, you're going to be checking the bar and all the other businesses to see if they have cameras, if anybody else happened to see anything, whatever the case may be. Fraud investigations, there's all kinds of fraud investigations. A person could spend an entire hour just talking about the different types of fraud investigations. Most popular fraud investigations are going to be like insurance fraud, workers' compensation fraud, things like that. But there's also business fraud, embezzlement, different types of fraud investigations. Skip tracing and locate investigations, they're kind of the same thing, but kind of different again. Skip tracing, if we're skip tracing you, we're going to run you through our databases. We're going to come up with the most likely address or addresses where you are. Usually that's going to be for service of process or something like that. We've got to get legal documents to you. So we're going to skip trace. We're going to do something fairly simple like that. A locate investigation, again, is more boots on the ground. I'm going to do everything I do in skip tracing, but I'm going to do a deep dive into the databases. I'm going to do a deep OSINT, open source intelligence. I'm going to come up with as much information as I can to include pictures and stuff like that. And then I'm going to go out and I'm going to try to verify it. I have your address, I have your vehicles. I'm going to see if your vehicles are at that house. I'm going to see if you're out there on a Sunday morning mowing the lawn or something like that. I'm going to try to verify that location where you're at. Open source intelligence investigations. This is, it's not real new, but it's kind of new. It's really the verbiage, if you will. OSINT is really getting out there now. It's a big buzzword. Everyone's using it, but it's been around for a very, very long time. It's just the big buzzword out there now. A lot of people just do OSINT. That's all they do. They're just, they just want to sit and they want to mine for data for hours and days on end looking for all that information. Wrongful death and serious bodily injury, those are usually tied hand in hand. That's going to require somebody with a lot more expertise than me. It's usually going to be somebody with former law enforcement experience, a coroner, something like that. They're really going to have to understand what wrongful death is and understand what serious bodily injury. I can't sit and look at pictures of an autopsy and tell you if it was done right or not done right. But I know a lot of people that can do that, and I will refer that work over, or if it's a large case, I'll bring them in as part of the investigation team. So the most common duties for private investigators. This really surprises people when I go through these. First and foremost, we are business owners and entrepreneurs. There are some large firms that have employees, but and this is anecdotal, but I would venture to say that somewhere between 85 and 90% of all private investigators out there are entrepreneurs. They are self-employed business owners. The others work for those large firms out there. Now, we do subcontract. I subcontract a lot of PIs. I have people that do surveillance for me. I have people that do bug sweeps for me. I have process servers. I'm getting too old to get chased off of porches serving papers. I'm getting too old to crawl underneath cars and look for GPS trackers and things like that. But I have all these other people that I hire as a subcontract that work for me from time to time. That's really how a lot of the work gets done. Sales calls. We're not necessarily making the calls, but I have to answer my phone when it rings or I'm not going to be feeding my family. That's just simple. Now, that is a huge part of our job, and it's hard to manage all of that. You've got to do everything else, and you've got to answer that. You've got to make the sale. You've got to write the contract. You've got to collect the money. You've got to do all of the accounting work. Now, I always tell PIs, if you're not proficient in any of these steps, then hire somebody else to do it. Again, I spent a lot of time in corporate America. I worked a lot with accounting departments, with legal departments, with marketing departments, everything like that. So I gained a lot of knowledge in that. So I'm very lucky and blessed that I'm able to do a lot of that stuff in my own business. But a lot of people aren't able to, so they have to hire somebody to do that accounting, because you got to account for the money. I don't do the big stuff at the end. I hire a CPA that takes care of all the year-end stuff, because I don't want to deal with the IRS and all that. I just write the check that they tell me to write. Marketing and advertising, it is huge, huge, huge. You guys are all entrepreneurs kind of in your own way, because you're writing books and you have to sell your books, and you need to know how to market it and how to get it out there. And you're either doing it yourself or you're doing it through an agency, or someone else is doing it for you. We have to get all of that stuff done. Business planning. This is very timely. I actually do a business plan every year, and then come July 1st, I'm looking into my business plan and I'm rewriting it for the year. I have to figure out where I'm going with my business, what's working, what's not working, where I need to focus. Investigation prep. Again, I do a lot of outsourcing, where I bring people in, subcontractors to do the investigation work, but I have to prep it all. If I'm hiring a guy to go out and do surveillance, I'm doing all that prep. I'm doing all that OSINT at the beginning. I'm looking up all the data. I'm putting together a cover sheet for them to go out. I'm finding the photos of the individual. I'm finding the vehicles. I am a lot of times, even on surveillance, going out and doing a pre-surveillance on the residence or the business. I'm looking to see what it's like, give them a good idea of what it's going to look like. So when they show up at 5 o'clock in the morning or 4 o'clock in the morning, they're not completely blind out there. They know what to expect. Report writing. We do a whole lot of report writing. I'll give you kind of an example on the workload. If a PI is doing surveillance, an average surveillance day is going to be 8 hours. That's 8 hours of surveillance. Okay, you're going to have an hour or two of prep before. You're going to have an hour driving to it. Usually you're going to have to commute somewhere to go do the surveillance. We always use an hour as a good round number. Do 8 hours of surveillance, you're going to have an hour going back home, and then you're going to have several hours of report writing and video editing at the end. So that 8 hour day is usually going to be a 12 or a 14-hour day. It's not as glamorous as you think. They don't hop in their car, run out in the red Ferrari, get on the street corner, grab some video, and then tell the guy, I caught you, run back home and call the guy and say, we got him, here's the video. You have to write the report. You have to make sure all of the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed. And then there's answering emails, and I get a ton of emails. I have 6 business lines, so managing emails is a huge task for me. In fact, I only look at my emails 4 times a day. That's how many emails I get. I give it 30 minutes 4 times a day that I look at my emails, and I have to quickly decipher, is this something that's going to be an action required, or something that I can quickly say yes, no, or whatever. But answering emails is huge for us. And then desk work. This is me most days for 8 hours a day, folks. This is being a PI. I'm sitting at a desk. I'm doing a whole lot of work. Well, that's just what I do.